Welcome back. This is part 2 of Are You Well Connected? Conversations Can Impact Your Wealth. We're about to pick up on the next section of Nicholas Christakis' 2010 TED Talk on the hidden influence of social networks.
And there can be many mechanisms for this effect. One possibility is that your friends say to you something like, they adopt a behavior that spreads to you, like they say, let's go have muffins and beer, which is a terrible combination. But you adopt that combination, and then you start gaining weight like them. And another more subtle possibility is that they start gaining weight, and it changes your ideas of what an acceptable body size is. And here, what's spreading from person to person is not a behavior, but rather a norm. An idea is spreading. Now, headline writers had a field day with our studies. I think the headline in the New York Times was, are you packing it on? Blame your fat friends. What was interesting to us is the European headline writers had a different take. They said, are your friends gaining weight? Perhaps you are to blame. And we thought this was a very interesting comment on American, kind of self-serving, not my responsibility kind of phenomenon. Now, I want to be very clear, we do not think our work should or could justify prejudice against people of one or another body size at all. Now, our next question was, could we actually visualize this spread? Was weight gain in one person actually spreading to weight gain in another person? And this is complicated because we needed to take into account the fact that the network structure, the architecture of the ties, was changing across time. And in addition, because obesity is not a unicentric epidemic. There's not like a patient zero of the obesity epidemic. We find that guy, there was a spread of obesity out from him. It's a multicentric epidemic. Lots of people are doing things at the same time. And I'm about to show you a 30-second video animation that took me 5 years, me and James, 5 years of our lives to do. And so again, every dot is a person. Every tie between them is a relationship. And we're going to put this into motion now, taking daily cuts through the network for about 30 years. The dot sizes are going to grow. You're going to see a sea of yellow take over. You're going to see people be born and die. Dots will appear and disappear. Ties will form and break. Marriages and divorces, friendings and defriendings. A lot of complexity. A lot is happening just in these 30-year period that includes the obesity epidemic. And by the end, you're going to see clusters of obese and non-obese individuals within the network. Now, when I looked at this, it changed the way I see things. Because this network that's changing across time has a memory, it moves, things flow within it, it has a kind of consistency. People can die, but it doesn't die, it still persists. And it has a kind of resilience that allows it to persist across time. And so I came to see these kinds of social networks as living things. As living things that we could put under a kind of microscope and study and analyze and understand. And we used a variety of techniques to do this, and we started exploring all kinds of other phenomena. So we looked at smoking and drinking behavior, and voting behavior, and divorce, which can spread, and altruism. And eventually we became interested in emotions. Now, when we have emotions, we show them. Why do we show our emotions? I mean, there would be an advantage to experiencing our emotions inside, anger or happiness. But we don't just experience them, we show them. And not only do we show them, but others can read them. And not only can they read them, but they copy them. There's emotional contagion that takes place in human populations. And so this function of emotions suggests that in addition to any other purpose they serve, they're a kind of primitive form of communication. And that in fact, if we really want to understand human emotions, we need to think about them in this way. Now, we're accustomed to thinking about emotions in this way in simple, sort of brief periods of time. So for example, I was giving this talk recently in New York City, and I said, like how when you're on the subway and the other person across the subway car smiles at you, and you just instinctively smile back. And they looked at me and said, we don't do that in New York City. And I said, everywhere else in the world, that's normal human behavior. And so there's a very instinctive way in which we briefly transmit emotions to each other. And in fact, emotional contagion can be broader still, like we can have punctuated expressions of anger, as in riots. The question that we wanted to ask was, could emotions spread in a more sustained way than riots across time and involve large numbers of people, not just these pair of individuals smiling at each other in the subway car. Maybe there's a kind of below the surface quiet riot that animates us all the time. Maybe there are emotional stampedes that ripple through human social networks. Maybe, in fact, emotions have a collective existence, not just an individual existence. And this is one of the first images we made to study this phenomenon. Again, a social network, but now we color the people yellow if they're happy and blue if they're sad, and green in between. And if you look at this image, you can right away see clusters of happy and unhappy people, again spreading to 3 degrees of separation. And you might form the intuition that the unhappy people occupy a different structural location within the network. So there's a middle and an edge to this network, and the unhappy people seem to be located at the edges. So to invoke another metaphor, if you imagine social networks as a kind of vast fabric of humanity, I'm connected to you and you to her, on out endlessly into the distance. This fabric is actually like an old-fashioned American quilt, and it has patches on it, happy and unhappy patches. And whether you become happy or not depends in part on whether you occupy a happy patch.
Dr. Cooper, he just finished talking about the happy and unhappy patches in our networks. Though, check me if I'm off here. It all goes right back to the conversations that people are in.
Absolutely. How do you know you're happy? How do you know you're sad or your friend is sad? They have to tell you.
Yeah. As he talked about these happy patches in a network, what I thought about is, are there wealthy patches of people in a network? For instance, the group of people that were originally behind PayPal. Each of that core team has gone on to be enormously successful in their chosen industries in ways that are literally transforming our world. And these were people that were working together, building companies in deep conversation with one another every day for years. And they built that first company on those conversations. When it comes back to the conversation of being able to afford something or not afford something, what would it mean to us if we created a patch of people in our network that had responsible conversations around money? And what if all these people weren't even responsible with their money? For instance, I've had a group of clients that I've worked with where not everyone became responsible with money. Not everyone became a client, but they still all began to talk a little bit differently about money than they had prior. And everyone noticed a difference among that group of people that had heard our philosophy versus all of their other friends. That's one of the reasons why we do the podcast, is to help people get those conversations in their networks. This applies to other areas of our life as well. If I want to lose 10 pounds, what are the conversations that I need to modify? Around marriage, my wife and I have a practice that if somebody in our core social network begins to have any kind of marital problems, we will go see a counselor and get coaching to protect us from the influences of the predominant conversation. Like there's something that's just like moving around the network, and we want to get our immunization to overcome it. I want to branch into what happens to these groups of people as we move through life with them. I think we've all had that experience where we go get drinks with somebody, reconnecting with a friend from high school or from college, and now we're just not in each other's everyday lives, maybe due to geography or career choices, and we spend that time with them and it's great. Though after, as we're driving home, we feel that bit of a loss. We've had those high school or college years together, and we love that. We love looking back on it. But I'm concerned myself with both our health and our wealth. Isn't it true that if I'm healthy at age 65 and people I love are not, there are things in life that they're not going to be able to do with me?
Absolutely.
And this may apply to some of our listeners and viewers right now. See, as we pass age 65, our friends are not people who we've been with in school for 4 years. These are people we have gone on those long vacations with, that we've raised our children with. Maybe our children married their children. We spent time with those families over 20, 30, 40 years of adulthood, and yet one day the future will financially be calling their bluff. And this huge lifespan that we all hope to have, that may be 30 or 40 years after age 65, and they're not going to be able to hang out with us.
Absolutely. They can't afford to live where you live. They can't afford the same schools.
One of the simple things I've done, if I'm not eating well, or if my wife and I are without like some friction between us, I'll just go digest material, books, YouTube, or podcasts on the subject, because I know if I'm exposed to something, I begin to talk about that thing, which then changes the predominant conversations around me and those things, and changes my behaviors and the outcomes. And this has been a relatively easy way for me to use judo on myself rather than society using judo on me all the time. And Dr. Cooper, if you would, could you stay with us here a few more minutes? I want us to be able to finish out the video and then land this with some practical thinking of what people can do to really shift these conversations in their networks and not just being the weird one in their community.
So, this work with emotions, which are so fundamental, then got us to thinking about maybe the fundamental causes of human social networks are somehow encoded in our genes. Because human social networks, whenever they are mapped, always kind of look like this, the picture of the network. But they never look like this. Why do they not look like this? Why don't we form human social networks that look like a regular lattice? Well, the striking patterns of human social networks, their ubiquity and their apparent purpose, beg questions about whether we evolved to have human social networks in the first place and whether we evolved to form networks with a particular structure. And so notice, first of all, so to understand this, though, we need to dissect network structure a little bit first. And notice that every person in this network has exactly the same structural location as every other person. But that's not the case with real networks. So for example, here's a real network of college students at an elite Northeastern university. And now I'm highlighting a few dots. And if you look here at the dots, compare node B in the upper left to node D in the far right. And B has 4 friends coming out from him, and D has 6 friends coming out from him. And so those 2 individuals have different numbers of friends. That's very obvious. We all know that. But certain other aspects of social network structure are not so obvious. Compare node B in the upper left to node A in the lower left. And now those people both have 4 friends. But A's friends all know each other, and B's friends do not. So the friend of A's is back again a friend of A's. Whereas the friend of B's is not a friend of B's, is farther away in the network. This is known as transitivity in networks. And finally, compare nodes C and D. C and D both have 6 friends. If you talk to them, they would say, and you said, what is your social life like? They would say, I've got 6 friends. That's my social experience. But now we, with a bird's eye view looking at this network, can see that they occupy very different social worlds. And I can cultivate that intuition in you by just asking you, who would you rather be if a deadly germ was spreading through the network? Would you rather be C or D? You'd rather be D, on the edge of the network. And now who would you rather be if a juicy piece of gossip, not about you, was spreading through the network? Now you would rather be C. So different structural locations have different implications for your life. And in fact, when we did some experiments looking at this, what we found is that 46% of the variation in how many friends you have is explained by your genes. And this is not surprising. We know some people are born shy and some are born gregarious. That's obvious. But we also found some non-obvious things. For instance, 47% in the variation in whether your friends know each other is attributable to your genes. Whether your friends know each other has not just to do with their genes, but with yours. And we think the reason for this is that some people like to introduce their friends to each other, you know who you are, and others of you keep them apart and don't introduce your friends to each other. And so some people knit together the networks around them, creating a kind of dense web of ties in which they're comfortably embedded. And finally, we even found that 30% of the variation in whether or not people are in the middle or on the edge of the network can also be attributed to their genes. So whether you find yourself in the middle or on the edge is also partially heritable. Now, what is the point of this? How does this help us understand? How does this help us figure out some of the problems that are affecting us these days? Well, the argument I'd like to make is that networks have value. They are a kind of social capital. New properties emerge because of our embeddedness in social networks. And these properties inhere in the structure of the networks, not just in the individuals within them. So think about these two common objects. They're both made of carbon. And yet, one of them has carbon atoms in it that are arranged in one particular way on the left, and you get graphite, which is soft and dark. But if you take the same carbon atoms and interconnect them a different way, you get diamond, which is clear and hard. And those properties of softness and hardness and darkness and clearness do not reside in the carbon atoms. They reside in the interconnections between the carbon atoms, or at least arise because of the interconnections between the carbon atoms. So similarly, the pattern of connections among people confers upon people, the groups of people, different properties. It is the ties between people that makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And so it is not just what's happening to these people, whether they're losing weight or gaining weight or becoming rich or becoming poor or becoming happy or not becoming happy that affects us. It's also the actual architecture of the ties around us. Our experience of the world depends on the actual structure of the networks in which we're residing and on all the kinds of things that ripple and flow through the network. Now, the reason I think that this is the case is that human beings assemble themselves and form a kind of superorganism. Now, superorganism is a collection of individuals which show or evince behaviors or phenomena that are not reducible to the study of individuals and must be understood by reference to and by studying the collective. Like, for example, a hive of bees that's finding a new nesting site, or a flock of birds that's evading a predator, or a flock of birds that's able to pool their wisdom and navigate and find a tiny speck of an island in the middle of the Pacific, or a pack of wolves that's able to bring down larger prey. Superorganisms have properties that cannot be understood just by studying the individuals. I think understanding social networks and how they form and operate can help us understand not just health and emotions, but all kinds of other phenomena, like crime and warfare, and economic phenomena, like bank runs and market crashes, and the adoption of innovation and the spread of product adoption. Now, look at this. I think we form social networks because the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. If I was always violent towards you, or gave you misinformation, or made you sad, or infected you with deadly germs, you would cut the ties to me and the network would disintegrate. So the spread of good and valuable things is required to sustain and nourish social networks. Similarly, social networks are required for the spread of good and valuable things, like love and kindness and happiness and altruism and ideas. I think, in fact, that if we realized how valuable social networks are, we'd spend a lot more time nourishing them and sustaining them. Because I think social networks are fundamentally related to goodness. And what I think the world needs now is more connections. Thank you.
The part of the video where he is sharing with us that we get kind of embedded in our network, and I even really like how he's kind of scrunched up like he's in a warm blanket, embedded in the network. Now, I don't know if for me in my life, if it's always been a good thing for me to be embedded in certain comfortable conversations. You'd mentioned something to me about how we can get embedded, but to what end? Like until all the other lemmings go off the cliff?
That's right. That's right. We are all going to seek comfort. And we're all going to seek being comfortably embedded. So then we have to look, what are you comfortably embedding yourself in? You're going to do it one way or the other. What kinds of networks, what kinds of conversations will you embed yourself in? You know, and it goes back to something a mentor of mine said to me once. He said, Kush, belonging will eat your children and your children's children. And here's what I got about what he said after I got over the whole cannibalism and eating my children thing. what I got was that we are social animals. We survived through belonging to a pack. It is fundamentally hardwired in us, so much so that we would consider sacrificing things very important to us in order to belong. So given that we are compelled to belong, the question then becomes, where will you belong? You're going to do it one way or the other. Are you going to belong in the healthy networks? Or are you going to belong in the responsible networks?
That reminds me of a time when I was in Laguna Beach years ago, out to a great dinner with friends who all had top income at the time. And because we were all just doing it, we walked through an art gallery and bought paintings of olives burning money and olives smoking cigars. I'm not joking. And thousands of dollars later, I had a bunch of artwork that is now nearly worthless. But the same thing happens with my eating. If everybody is at the barbecue and they're all having like hamburgers with buns, now I'm the only one eating without a bun. Then after that, I can end up making a bad eating decision. Now I think all of you watching may think to yourself that most polite people don't talk about money. Though I want to share with you that most people don't have their money handled. All of the people who have their money handled, do you think that they just did it on their own without having anyone? Or do you think they had their spouses having conversations with them about it? Did they have someone that's some kind of trusted advisor? There's stories in the cartoons and fables where some grumpy old man gets really, really, really rich and doesn't have anyone around him to talk with about his money. But that's a fiction. In the rare instance that somebody does do it, that single person without any community around them, it's big news because it is so rare. People do this in networks, helping each other in conversations, learning together so that they can make the decisions. My wife and I have, along with a close group of our friends, changed the way that we view money so that we can get comfortably embedded inside a group of people that aren't seduced by the next Tesla release or the crazy expensive vacations. Not that we don't do the Ritz-Carlton vacations ever, just nowhere near as often as we could afford it. Here in a moment in our next video, I'm going to introduce you to something we call the relationship model. This tool will help you understand what you and your network talk about in different areas of your life that you might care about. Different conversations about your life that you might care about and how you might begin to explore your own social network and its impact. Of course, Sound Financial Group, what we deal with is money. Though we will show you how to use this tool to create better outcomes in other areas of your life. Now, Dr. Cooper, before we jump into the next video, we've got this human need for belonging. We want to create a future and move the needle inside of our existing networks and relationships without being that guy or that girl, the person that everyone kind of rolls their eyes at and says, oh, there they are again, up to some weird thing. How do our audience begin to shift the conversation of their network?
Paul, it's a numbers game. You have to start really watching what falls out of your mouth. If you are going to say, I'm hungry, we don't have time, let's go through the drive-through often, then that's the kind of life you're going to have. If you say, I'm hungry, let's go to the freezer to microwave the pre-made healthy foods and snacks we had, then that's the kind of life you're going to have. Yeah. So the life you have is a function of how much you say about that life. And so you just really have to watch everything that comes out of your mouth.
For everyone listening, you can tell that Dr. Cooper is brilliant. And I'm just not that kind of intellectual horsepower. So given what I just heard Dr. Cooper said, here's my simple translation. I could ask myself, given what I just said, what future is that going to create for me? We could all use that as a litmus test that I think would work for any area of life. If I just said or did this, is it going to work out well for me? Might be the best way to put it, or it might just come down to creating a future that's problematic. A few problematic phrases that you might actually be saying right now in the conversations all around you. Like in the area of eating and health would be, you deserve it. Around money, it would be, I can afford it. And around relationships might be, I think they'll just understand. These are all things that if you're saying them, you may need to pause and check if that way of speaking is going to create the future that you want. Dr. Kush Cooper, thank you again. And I hope everybody listening to this enjoyed it. In our next episode, we'll get to the relationship model.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure, Paul. Thank you.
I'm so glad you could join us for part 2. There's just one section left. Instructions on how you can use the relationship model in your life. I would encourage you to share this video with a few people so you can have conversations about it. Subscribe to our channel and send us an email or go to the show notes and download the relationship model to begin to assess your network of conversations that you're living in. And I'll see you in part 3.